A judge tried to silence Pam Bondi with a sudden $110,000 fine, but within minutes she turned the tables and left him questioning his own ruling. You won't believe how this courtroom showdown unfolded. Before we dive into the story, comment where you're watching from and hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the latest stories. It was supposed to be an ordinary day for Pam Bondi. Courtroom 3B in the heart of Tampa was just another stop on her schedule, a routine hearing that would barely make a dent in her morning. Having faced countless judges in this very room, there was nothing unusual about today, or so she thought. Seated at the defendant's table, her face remained composed as she skimmed through her notes. Across the room, the city attorney nervously adjusted his tie, shifting in his chair as he awaited the judge's arrival. Little did he know, the calm before the storm was about to shatter. The case was a minor dispute, or at least that's what it was supposed to be, a procedural matter that shouldn't have taken more than 10 minutes. But the moment Judge Raymond Dalton walked in, Pam knew something was off. Dalton was a man who commanded the room without saying much. Tall, with a graying beard and deep-set eyes, he carried an air of authority that was impossible to ignore. Normally, judges took a moment to review files, give a nod to the attorneys, and settle in before making any remarks. Not Dalton. "Let's get right to it," he said, his voice flat, expression unreadable. Pam straightened slightly, sensing the shift in tone. "The court has reviewed the matter at hand," Dalton continued, "and after considering the arguments, I find that the defendant is in violation of Local Statute 14B and is therefore subject to a fine of $110,000 payable immediately." Silence. Pam's brow lifted just slightly, but inside her mind was already working. She had expected an argument, a discussion, maybe even a warning. But this? A summary judgment without a word of discussion? The city attorney glanced at her, almost apologetic. Even he hadn't expected the case to move this fast. Pam calmly folded her hands, her voice even. "Your Honor, with all due respect, we haven't even begun proceedings. I haven't had the chance to present my argument." Dalton barely blinked. "The arguments are irrelevant. The violation is clear. The law is clear." Pam inhaled slowly, keeping her expression unreadable. The room was still too. She wasn't the kind of attorney to lose her composure, but something about this felt deliberate. This wasn't just a ruling. This was a statement. She glanced at Dalton, studying him. There was something behind his eyes, a confidence that went beyond simple judicial authority. He wasn't just ruling on a case. He was putting her in her place. Pam's voice remained measured but firm. "If the law were that clear, we wouldn't be here, Your Honor. I request the opportunity to present my defense." Dalton leaned back slightly, as if he had expected her to push back. His lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You're welcome to try, Miss Bondi, but I assure you the outcome will be the same." That was when she knew this wasn't just about the case. It was about her. Pam adjusted the papers in front of her, more for effect than necessity. The fine itself wasn't the issue. She'd fought bigger battles. But the principle? That was something she couldn't ignore. She met Dalton's gaze directly. "Then, I suppose we should get started." The tension in the room thickened. The city attorney shifted again, uncomfortable. The court stenographer, silent until now, repositioned in her chair. Even a few spectators in the back leaned forward slightly, sensing that something unusual was about to unfold. Pam took one last glance at the legal brief in front of her, though she didn't really need it. She already knew what she was going to do. Dalton thought he had the upper hand, but he was about to realize this wasn't going to be as easy as he thought. Before anyone could speak again, Pam raised her hand, a signal that she wasn't finished, and what came next would leave the entire courtroom stunned. Pam let the silence linger just long enough to make an impact. She didn't rush, didn't flinch. She simply turned one page in her folder, more for effect than necessity. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. Before finally looking up at Judge Dalton, Pam took a steady breath. "Your Honor, before I proceed, I'd like to clarify something." Her voice was steady, unwavering. "Are you saying that the defense has no right to present arguments in a legal proceeding?" Dalton's expression didn't change. "I'm saying the violation is clear, and the fine stands." Pam tilted her head slightly, as if studying him, then nodded. "Interesting." Dalton raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me? Pam leaned back just a little, keeping her tone casual. It's just, I've been practicing law for quite some time, and in all those years, I've never encountered a judge who dismissed a defense before hearing a single word of it. It's, what's the phrase? Unprecedented. Dalton's jaw tightened. Pam knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't outright challenging him yet. She was setting the stage, forcing him to respond. The spectators in the gallery, mostly lawyers and law clerks waiting for their cases, were now fully invested. A few exchanged glances. Even the bailiff, a man who had probably seen 1,000 hearings just like this one, shifted ever so slightly. Dalton let out a slow breath. Miss Bondi, this court does not exist for theatrics. If you have a legal argument, make it. Otherwise the fine stands and we move on. Pam gave a small, knowing smile. There it was. He'd opened the door. She adjusted her papers again, but this time she didn't look down at them. She looked directly at the judge. Very well, let's talk about Local Statute 14b, the one you claim I violated. She tapped her finger on the printed document in front of her. You say the law is clear. But that's interesting, because I happen to know that this very statute has been challenged multiple times over the past 5 years, with varying interpretations. Dalton's eyes narrowed. The language in subsection C, for example, Pam continued, her voice smooth, almost conversational, is so vague that it's been ruled unenforceable in at least 3 separate cases. And let's not forget that just last year a ruling from the appellate court found that imposing fines under this statute without allowing for due process constitutes a direct violation of constitutional protections. The courtroom was completely silent. Pam could feel the shift happening. The judge knew it too. Dalton straightened, his tone sharpening. Those cases do not apply here. Pam didn't miss a beat. Don't they? She turned another page. Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like they do. The language of the ruling in Reynolds v. Clearwater was pretty clear. An administrative fine issued without evidentiary consideration is subject to reversal on procedural grounds. She let the words sink in before adding, and I'm sure Your Honor wouldn't want to ignore a precedent. Dalton clenched his jaw. Pam let that hang in the air for just a second before delivering the next blow. Unless, of course, this court is prepared to disregard established case law, in which case I'd be happy to file an appeal. Dalton leaned forward, folding his hands in front of him. Are you threatening this court with an appeal, Miss Bondi? Pam exhaled through her nose, a quiet laugh without amusement. Your Honor, I don't make threats. I cite the law. A murmur rippled through the back of the courtroom. Pam had done something subtle but important. She had shifted the power dynamic. She had forced the judge to defend his position rather than simply issuing rulings without question. Dalton knew it too. The city attorney, who had been sitting quietly up until now, cleared his throat. Your Honor, if I may... Dalton lifted a hand, cutting him off. His eyes stayed locked on Pam's. There was a long pause. Then, finally, the judge spoke. Very well, you may present your defense. Pam smiled, but only slightly. She wasn't celebrating yet. This was only the beginning. But just as she was about to speak, Dalton did something that made it clear he wasn't going to make this easy. Judge Dalton didn't break eye contact as he leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. Proceed, he said, his voice carrying a weight that felt more like a warning than permission. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. She understood exactly where she stood in his courtroom, but she wasn't the type to be intimidated. She adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Let's start with the language of the statute itself. She tapped her papers. Local Statute 14b claims that any entity failing to comply with a municipal regulation may be fined. Simple enough. But the issue arises in how compliance is defined. The language is broad, overly vague, and inconsistent with constitutional due process protections. Dalton exhaled slowly, looking unimpressed. And yet, Miss Bondi, this statute has been enforced repeatedly without issue. Pam tilted her head. That's interesting, because according to public records, at least 4 previous cases resulted in partial or full dismissals due to the very vagueness I'm pointing out now. She glanced at the city attorney, then back at Dalton. Unless you'd like to argue that due process only applies when it's convenient. Dalton's grip on the bench tightened slightly. Miss Bondi, if your argument hinges on vague procedural objections, I suggest you reconsider. The law is enforced as written. Pam paused for a beat before responding, except when it isn't. A murmur came from the back of the room. Pam reached for another document and held it up. Let's talk about Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg. The defendant in that case was fined under this very statute. Same wording, same enforcement method, but the appellate court ruled that the city's interpretation violated state-level protections. She paused for emphasis. You know what the judge said in that ruling? That the law, as applied, fails to provide sufficient notice or clear standards for enforcement, rendering it unenforceable under scrutiny. Dalton's expression remained blank, but the tension in his jaw said enough. The city attorney leaned in slightly. Your Honor, I believe we're getting sidetracked. Pam turned her gaze toward him, cutting him off before he could continue. Counselor, I'd love to hear how you reconcile this ruling with the fine your office is trying to enforce today. If you have a legal basis that contradicts Henderson, please enlighten us. The attorney hesitated. His silence spoke volumes. Pam turned back to Dalton. Respectfully, Your Honor, I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for consistency. If a higher court has already determined that this statute is problematic, how does this court justify imposing a penalty under it? Dalton sat back, his eyes scanning her, calculating. Pam knew exactly what he was doing, stalling, trying to find an angle where he could regain control. Finally, he spoke. The circumstances of that case are not identical to yours. Pam didn't even blink. True, but the precedent applies all the same. The law is either clear or it isn't. Silence. The weight in the room had shifted. Pam knew she had the judge cornered. Not because he was legally wrong, though he was, but because she had forced him into a position where any decision he made now would be under scrutiny. He could push forward, ignore precedent, and risk having his ruling overturned, or he could backpedal, which would mean conceding that he had acted prematurely. Pam didn't envy his position, but then again he was the one who had put himself there. Dalton let out a slow breath. Ms. Bondi, I find your interpretation debatable. Pam smiled slightly. Then let's debate it. The judge's nostrils flared slightly. Then, to her surprise, he reached for his gavel. The court will take a 15-minute recess. He stood before anyone could argue, then turned and disappeared into his chambers. Pam set her papers down, her expression calm, but inside she knew what had just happened. Dalton wasn't ready to give in, but he also wasn't ready to rule against her outright. He needed time, to think, to strategize, maybe even to look up the case she had just cited. That meant she had him on the ropes. But when he returned, he wouldn't be alone, and what happened next would take this fight to an entirely different level. 15 minutes felt like an hour. Pam remained seated at the defense table, her hands resting lightly on the stack of papers in front of her. She wasn't reading them. She didn't need to. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. The legal precedents, the procedural arguments, the case laws she had cited, they were all burned into her mind. She was ready. But something about Judge Dalton's abrupt recess didn't sit right with her. He wasn't the type to hesitate, which meant he was either regrouping or preparing for something she hadn't accounted for. The door to the judge's chamber swung open, and Dalton strode back in with a new presence by his side. A second judge, someone Pam immediately recognized, Judge Alan Whitaker, a senior judge, higher ranking than Dalton. The moment Whitaker entered, the mood in the courtroom shifted. This wasn't standard protocol. Bringing in another judge mid-hearing wasn't just unusual, it was calculated. Pam adjusted her posture, keeping her expression unreadable. Dalton took his seat, clearing his throat. Before we proceed, I've requested that Judge Whitaker sit in on this matter. Requested? Pam didn't believe that for a second. Someone had pulled strings. Whitaker gave her a slow nod, his presence calm but authoritative. Ms. Bondi, I understand you've raised procedural concerns regarding the enforcement of Statute 14b. Pam met his gaze evenly. That's correct. Whitaker clasped his hands in front of him. You believe this fine should be overturned based on appellate precedent? She didn't hesitate. I don't believe it. I know it. A faint murmur rippled through the courtroom. Dalton's lips pressed into a thin line. Whitaker arched an eyebrow. I appreciate your confidence, but let's discuss specifics. You referenced Henderson v. City of St. Petersburg. Are you aware that a follow-up ruling later clarified that certain interpretations of the statute could remain enforceable under localized judicial discretion? Pam kept her expression neutral, but inside, she felt the shift. So that's what this was. Dalton had stepped back, brought in someone with more authority, and now they were attempting to counter her argument with an overlooked technicality. Pam folded her hands. I am aware of that ruling, Your Honor, but I also know that the same clarification explicitly stated that enforcement must adhere to strict evidentiary standards, something that, in this case, was not done. Whitaker nodded, as if he had expected her to say that. Then let's talk about that. The enforcement officer who filed the violation is present in this courtroom. Would you like to cross-examine him? Pam barely hid her surprise. She hadn't expected that, but she welcomed it. She turned her head as a man stood from the back of the room. Officer Brian Calloway, a municipal enforcement officer. He was middle-aged, dressed in a crisp Navy uniform, and carried himself with the confidence of someone who rarely had to justify his decisions. Pam kept her voice steady. Yes, Your Honor, I would. Dalton gestured for Calloway to step forward. The officer made his way to the witness stand, took his oath, and sat down. Pam stood, walking toward him with slow, deliberate steps. Officer Calloway, can you confirm that you were the one who issued this violation? He nodded. Yes, ma'am. Pam turned slightly toward the jury box, where no jury was present, but where the public sat watching. And on what basis did you determine a violation had occurred? Calloway exhaled, as if the answer was obvious. The statute is clear. The property in question was not in compliance with municipal code. I documented it and issued the fine. Pam clasped her hands behind her back. Did you take any photographs of the alleged violation? He hesitated. No, ma'am, it wasn't necessary. She gave him a small, almost amused smile. You didn't document the violation, yet you issued a fine? Calloway shifted in his seat. I have years of experience identifying these cases. I didn't need a photo to confirm what I saw. Pam's expression remained calm, but inside she knew she had just been handed her next argument on a silver platter. She turned back toward the bench. Your Honor, in the absence of photographic evidence, written witness statements, or any tangible proof, we are left with nothing more than an individual's subjective assessment. This directly contradicts the evidentiary standards required under the law. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. The pellet clarification Judge Whitaker referenced earlier. Whitaker's expression didn't change, but he sat back slightly. He knew she was right. Pam pressed forward. So I ask again, how does this court justify imposing a fine under a statute that lacks the required legal foundation for enforcement? The silence in the room was deafening. Judge Dalton's fingers drummed against the bench. He wasn't looking at Whitaker, and that told Pam everything she needed to know. He had expected to win this argument. He had expected Whitaker's presence to back her into a corner. But instead, she had taken his own counterpoint and used it to unravel the case against her. Dalton exhaled sharply. This court will take another recess. Pam resisted the urge to smile. She knew exactly what was happening. They were running out of ways to push back. But when the court reconvened, what Dalton did next was something no one saw coming. Pam remained seated as the courtroom buzzed with quiet murmurs. Another recess? That wasn't a good sign for the judge. That meant he was struggling to regain control of a situation that had already slipped through his fingers. But she knew better than to celebrate too soon. Dalton was a man of authority, and if there was one thing people in power hated, it was being challenged. He wasn't going to back down that easily. When the court reconvened, Dalton's demeanor had shifted. Gone was the passive confidence he had walked in with earlier. Now his jaw was set, his expression unreadable. Whitaker was still seated beside him, though this time his posture was more reserved. It was clear he had no intention of intervening, at least not yet. Dalton cleared his throat. Miss Bondi, you've presented compelling arguments. His tone was measured, but Pam could hear the tightness in it. He wasn't used to admitting even the smallest concession. However, this court still finds the core issue remains unchanged. The fine stands. Pam blinked once. That was interesting. So he was doubling down. She exhaled slowly, nodding as if she was considering his words carefully. Then, without missing a beat, she turned to the court stenographer. "Can you read back the last statement, please?" The stenographer, a woman in her 40s with sharp eyes, barely hesitated before repeating, "The fine stands." Pam turned back to Dalton. "Your Honor, just so I understand correctly, are you stating on record that a municipal fine can be imposed without evidentiary proof in direct contradiction to established appellate precedent?" Dalton's fingers twitched against the bench. "Ms. Bondi, this court has discretion." Pam's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "It does, but discretion is not immunity from legal standards." The city attorney shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing where this was going. Pam straightened, stepping closer to the bench. "Let's put this in plain terms, shall we? If this ruling stands, it sets a precedent that any enforcement officer can issue a fine based on nothing more than their word. No evidence, no documentation, just an assertion." Dalton's silence told her everything she needed to know. She turned to the gallery, sweeping her gaze across the attorneys, clerks, and bystanders who had sat through the hearing. Imagine the implications of that. A business owner gets fined for a violation that may or may not exist. A homeowner is penalized for something they can't even verify. And if they challenge it, too bad. The court has discretion. A few heads nodded subtly. Pam turned back to Dalton. "That's not discretion, Your Honor. That's unchecked authority." The weight of her words sank into the room. Whitaker finally spoke. "You're arguing that allowing this fine to proceed without evidence would undermine due process?" Pam nodded. "Not just due process, but judicial integrity. Because the moment we accept rulings based on assertion rather than evidence, the entire legal system starts to erode." Dalton's grip on the bench tightened. He knew he had been backed into a corner. The city attorney finally interjected. "Your Honor, if I may." Dalton held up a hand. His face was unreadable, but Pam could see the frustration in his eyes. There was no winning this. Not for him. Like, subscribe, and comment. Let us know what you thought of this story and where you're watching from. Your support means the world to us. After what felt like an eternity, Dalton exhaled. This court finds that the imposed fine does not meet the necessary evidentiary threshold for enforcement. His voice was stiff, almost reluctant. The fine is overturned. A murmur rippled through the room. Pam gave a slow, polite nod. No satisfaction. No gloating. Just quiet certainty. Dalton tapped his gavel against the bench. Court adjourned. Just like that, it was over. Pam gathered her papers, tucking them neatly into her folder. As she turned to leave, she caught Whitaker watching her, his expression unreadable. Then, just as she stepped toward the exit, she heard Dalton's voice one last time. "Miss Bondi." She turned. Dalton's eyes met hers. "I underestimated you." Pam gave him a small smile. "You wouldn't be the first." She turned and walked out of the courtroom, her heels clicking against the polished floor. But as she left, she knew one thing for certain. This case wouldn't just be forgotten. It had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond this courtroom, and somewhere in another case, another judge would think twice before assuming they held all the power. Pam walked down the marble hallway, her pace steady but her mind still sharp. The weight of what had just happened wasn't lost on her. She had walked into that courtroom expecting a routine hearing. What she got instead was a battle of power, law, and ego, and she had won. But she also knew something else. People like Dalton didn't forget moments like these. They didn't like losing, especially not in front of a full courtroom. As she neared the courthouse exit, a voice called from behind, "Miss Bondi, a moment!" She turned to find Judge Whitaker approaching, his expression still unreadable. He wasn't the kind of man who engaged in unnecessary small talk, so if he was stopping her now, it wasn't just to exchange pleasantries. Pam crossed her arms loosely. "Something on your mind, Judge?" Whitaker studied her for a moment before speaking. "You're good." Pam smiled slightly. "I try." He nodded, glancing briefly at the courtroom doors behind him before lowering his voice just enough so only she could hear. "I wasn't brought in to observe, Miss Bondi. I was brought in to contain." Pam raised an eyebrow. To contain what exactly? Whitaker exhaled, his eyes scanning hers. Judge Dalton doesn't like losing. In this case, it wasn't just about a fine. It was about setting an example. Pam already knew that, but hearing it confirmed only made the victory feel more significant. She kept her voice even. "So what happens now?" Whitaker hesitated, then gave her a look that held both respect and warning. "You'll have people watching you, and not just here." Pam understood exactly what he meant. Today, she had done more than win a case. She had challenged a system that thrived on compliance, and that didn't go unnoticed. She nodded once. "I appreciate the heads up." Whitaker gave her one last look before stepping back toward the courtroom. Pam turned toward the exit, pushing the heavy courthouse doors open and stepping into the bright afternoon sun. The air felt different, lighter, sharper. This wasn't the first time she had fought a battle in court, and it wouldn't be the last. But there was a lesson in today's fight, one she hoped others would see. Power wasn't about who sat behind the bench. It wasn't about titles, robes, or authority. It was about knowing the rules well enough to challenge them. It was about standing firm when others expected you to back down, and most importantly, it was about never assuming that just because someone hands you a ruling, you have to accept it. Pam Bondi had walked into that courtroom expecting a standard hearing. She walked out having reminded everyone, especially those in power, that the law wasn't just about enforcement, it was about understanding. It was about fighting back. And today, she had done just that. Pam Bondi's courtroom battle teaches us a profound lesson. True power lies not in authority, but in understanding and courageously challenging the rules when they're unjust. She didn't just fight a fine, she exposed a flaw in the system, proving that standing firm against overreach can shift the balance, even against the odds. In life, this reminds us to question what's handed to us, whether it's a decision, a rule, or an expectation, and to arm ourselves with knowledge or resolve. When we face unfairness, we don't have to quietly accept it. We can push back with reason and strength, just as Pam did. Thanks for watching this incredible story. Your support keeps us going. Drop a comment below with your thoughts or where you're tuning in from, and subscribe so you never miss what's next.